The fastest way to lose the respect of a community is to judge a man before you learn his name. That quiet truth would come alive on a calm Tuesday morning in Greenville, South Carolina, where nothing seemed unusual until two police cruisers rolled slowly into a peaceful neighborhood lined with maple trees and neatly trimmed lawns. The sun had barely climbed above the rooftops, casting long golden shadows across freshly cut grass, while sprinklers clicked rhythmically from yard to yard. Children waited for the school bus with oversized backpacks. Neighbors waved as they collected newspapers from their front porches, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through open kitchen windows. It was the kind of morning that made people believe nothing extraordinary could possibly happen. Marcus Bennett certainly believed it. At 42 years old, Marcus had built a quiet life that reflected patience more than ambition. Every morning followed the same comfortable rhythm. He watered the flower beds his late mother had once planted, checked the small American flag beside his front porch to make sure it stood straight, and greeted every passerby with the same warm smile that had become part of the neighborhood itself. People knew Marcus as the man who shoveled snow from elderly neighbors' driveways before clearing his own, the volunteer who organized food drives every Thanksgiving, and the calm voice who somehow managed to settle disagreements without raising his own. To most people on Maple Ridge Lane, Marcus represented stability. Yet sometimes stability can disappear in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The distant hum of engines grew louder until two black and white patrol vehicles turned the corner almost simultaneously, their tires rolling slowly along the quiet residential street before stopping directly in front of Marcus's house. Conversations faded. A child paused halfway up the sidewalk. Curtains shifted as neighbors instinctively looked through their windows. Even the birds seemed quieter. Marcus turned toward the vehicles with a puzzled expression, still holding the garden hose loosely in one hand. The front doors opened almost in perfect sync. Officer Ryan Collins stepped out first, followed closely by Officer Jacob Mercer. Both wore expressions that suggested complete certainty, the kind of confidence that leaves little room for questions. Without hesitation, they walked across the lawn toward Marcus, who calmly shut off the water and placed the hose neatly beside the flower bed. He raised his empty hand slightly, more out of courtesy than concern. "Good morning, officers," he said with an easy smile. "Can I help you with something?" Neither officer returned the greeting. Ryan glanced briefly at a photograph hanging beside the front door before focusing entirely on Marcus. Jacob rested one hand near his duty belt while studying Marcus with quiet suspicion. The warmth of the morning seemed to evaporate as an uncomfortable silence settled over the yard. Across the street, a young mother instinctively reached for her phone. An elderly neighbor slowly lowered his coffee mug, unable to look away. Marcus noticed every anxious face around him, yet his own expression never changed. He simply waited. Then Ryan spoke in a firm, controlled voice that carried farther than he probably intended. "Marcus Bennett, we need you to come with us." Marcus blinked once, maintaining the same calm composure. "There must be some misunderstanding," he replied gently. "I haven't gone anywhere this morning." Before anyone else could say another word, the quiet neighborhood held its breath, unaware that within minutes a single phone call would transform this ordinary front yard into the moment an entire police department would never forget. Marcus slowly set the garden hose completely aside and folded his hands in front of him, making it unmistakably clear that he intended to cooperate. His breathing remained steady, his shoulders relaxed, and his voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime believing that respect usually invited respect in return. Around him, however, the atmosphere had changed. What had started as another peaceful morning now felt strangely suspended, as though the entire neighborhood had paused to witness something no one could yet understand. Officer Ryan Collins removed a folded sheet of paper from a folder tucked beneath his arm. He glanced at it briefly before looking back at Marcus. "We have received information that requires us to ask you several questions," he said in a measured tone. "Until we sort this out, we need your cooperation." Marcus nodded without hesitation. "You have it," he answered. "If there's a misunderstanding, I'm sure we can clear it up." His willingness to cooperate should have lowered the tension, but instead it seemed to make Ryan even more determined to follow procedure exactly as he understood it. Officer Jacob Mercer quietly stepped closer, carefully observing every movement Marcus made. Neither officer appeared openly hostile, yet both carried themselves with the rigid certainty that often accompanies assumptions formed before conversations begin. The front door opened behind Marcus. His wife, Angela Bennett, stepped onto the porch, still wearing the cardigan she had thrown over her work clothes after hearing unfamiliar voices outside. She looked from Marcus to the patrol cars and immediately sensed that something was wrong. "Marcus," she called softly, "is everything all right?" Marcus turned only enough to reassure her with a gentle smile. "Everything is fine, Angela. They just have a few questions." His words sounded calm, but Angela noticed the unusual seriousness on the officers' faces. Their 16-year-old son, Caleb, appeared behind her, followed moments later by 12-year-old Ava, who instinctively reached for her mother's hand. Neither child understood why so many neighbors were suddenly standing outside, watching their family. Across the street, Mr. Franklin, a retired mail carrier who had lived on Maple Ridge Lane for more than 30 years, slowly walked toward the sidewalk. He had watched Marcus grow into the dependable man everyone respected. The sight unfolding before him simply did not match the man he knew. Other neighbors quietly gathered near their driveways, exchanging uncertain glances but saying very little. No one wanted to interfere, yet no one wanted to leave either. The silence itself became part of the moment. Ryan finally spoke again. "Sir, for everyone's safety, we are going to place temporary restraints while we complete our investigation." Angela immediately took a step forward. "Temporary restraints? On what grounds?" she asked, her voice controlled but unmistakably concerned. Ryan remained professional. "Ma'am, we are following department procedure." Marcus looked at his wife before she could say anything else. His expression asked her to remain calm, and after a long breath, she reluctantly nodded. Marcus extended his hands without argument. The metallic click echoed across the otherwise quiet street, drawing more curtains aside as additional neighbors looked through their windows. Caleb lowered his eyes, struggling to understand what he was seeing, while Ava squeezed her mother's hand even tighter. Marcus noticed both of them and offered the same reassuring smile he had given countless times throughout their lives, a smile that quietly promised everything would be all right, even though deep inside he had begun asking himself the same question everyone else was silently wondering. How had an ordinary Tuesday morning become something that none of them would ever forget? Marcus stood quietly on the front walkway, the morning sunlight stretching across the concrete beneath his feet, while the neighborhood watched in uneasy silence. The temporary restraints around his wrists had changed the atmosphere more than anyone wanted to admit. A few minutes earlier, children had been laughing as they waited for the school bus. Now, their parents gently encouraged them to keep moving, though many adults remained where they were, unable to look away. The quiet confidence that usually defined Maple Ridge Lane had been replaced by uncertainty. Angela stepped down from the porch one careful step at a time, stopping only a few feet away from her husband. She searched his face for signs of fear, frustration, or anger, but found none. Marcus looked at her with the same reassuring expression he had worn for years whenever life presented unexpected challenges. "Please take the kids inside if they become uncomfortable," he said softly. Angela slowly shook her head. "We are staying right here." Caleb stood beside his mother with his jaw clenched, trying to understand why his father, a man who volunteered at community events and coached youth basketball every summer, was suddenly being treated like someone the neighborhood did not recognize. Ava held tightly to a small stuffed rabbit she had carried outside without realizing it, her young eyes fixed on her father without saying a single word. Officer Ryan Collins spoke briefly into his shoulder radio before looking back toward Marcus. "We are waiting for additional confirmation," he explained. "This should not take long." Marcus nodded politely. "I appreciate you letting me know." His calm response seemed almost unexpected. Ryan had prepared himself for arguments, demands, or raised voices. Instead, the man standing before him continued to cooperate with remarkable patience. Officer Jacob Mercer surveyed the property while quietly observing details that had escaped his attention only moments earlier. Near the front entrance hung a framed certificate recognizing years of community service. Beside it rested several photographs taken during neighborhood charity events, school fundraisers, and holiday food drives. Another photograph showed Marcus standing beside uniformed officers during a public safety event held the previous summer. Jacob studied the image for only a moment before turning away, dismissing it as nothing more than another community gathering. Across the street, Mr. Franklin slowly approached the edge of the sidewalk. "Officers," he called respectfully, "I have known Marcus for almost 20 years. There has to be some mistake." Ryan acknowledged the older man with a courteous nod. "Sir, we appreciate your concern, but we need everyone to remain where they are while we complete our work." Mr. Franklin sighed quietly and stepped back, though his worried expression never changed. Several neighbors exchanged whispers that drifted softly through the still morning air. Some wondered what had happened. Others insisted Marcus had always been one of the most dependable people they had ever known. More phones quietly appeared as residents documented the unusual scene, not out of excitement, but because something about the situation simply did not feel right. Marcus noticed the growing crowd and slowly turned toward them. "Everything will be all right," he said in a calm voice that carried farther than he intended. "Please do not argue with the officers." The request surprised everyone, including Ryan and Jacob. Rather than encouraging confrontation, Marcus seemed determined to keep the neighborhood peaceful. That single choice left an unexpected impression on several people watching from nearby driveways. Then, from farther down the street, another patrol vehicle appeared at the intersection. It slowed as it approached the growing crowd, and a young uniformed officer behind the wheel looked toward Marcus for only a brief second before his expression changed completely. He stared through the windshield as though he had just recognized someone he never expected to see standing in that position. Without saying a word to anyone outside, he immediately reached for his department radio, his voice suddenly lower and far more urgent than before. The young officer's voice remained low as he spoke in his radio, careful not to draw attention from the growing crowd. "Dispatch, this is Officer Noah Carter. I need immediate confirmation on a priority contact. Please notify Chief Daniel Harper that I have identified an individual at the current scene who may require his direct attention." The dispatcher responded with routine questions, but Noah interrupted politely. "Please tell the chief it concerns Marcus Bennett. He will understand." The radio fell silent for a moment before the dispatcher acknowledged the message with unexpected urgency. Noah lowered the microphone slowly, never taking his eyes off Marcus. Something about the entire situation felt deeply wrong. He had attended a leadership seminar only 6 months earlier where Marcus had spoken to dozens of officers about community trust, ethical decision-making, and the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. Marcus had never introduced himself with titles or accomplishments. He had simply spoken about listening before judging and treating every citizen with dignity. Noah remembered leaving that seminar, believing he had met one of the wisest public servants in the state. Now that same man stood quietly outside his own home while neighbors watched in confusion. Noah stepped out of his patrol vehicle and approached Ryan Collins with measured caution. "Ryan," he said quietly, "how certain are we about this identification?" Ryan answered without hesitation. "We are following information provided through official channels. Everything is being verified." Noah glanced toward Marcus again before lowering his voice even further. "I think we should slow down until the chief gets here." Ryan frowned slightly. "Why?" Noah hesitated for only a second. "Because I know who he is." Those 4 words hung between them like a sudden change in the weather. Jacob Mercer looked toward Noah with visible curiosity. "You have met him before?" Noah nodded. "More than once." Ryan folded his arms. "Then explain." Noah chose his words carefully. "I cannot explain everything because some of it was discussed during department training, but I can tell you this. Marcus Bennett is not someone we should make assumptions about." Ryan remained unconvinced. "Everyone deserves equal treatment under the law." "Exactly," Noah replied calmly. That is why I think we should make absolutely certain we understand the full situation before we take another step." While the officers quietly exchanged words, Marcus continued standing peacefully, occasionally smiling toward neighbors who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Angela noticed Noah's expression and sensed the conversation had shifted. She did not know what had been said, but for the first time since the patrol cars arrived, she saw uncertainty appear on one of the officers' faces. Across the street, Mr. Franklin whispered to another neighbor, "Something just changed." More residents slowly gathered along the sidewalks, though everyone kept a respectful distance. The neighborhood was no longer filled with curiosity alone. It had become filled with anticipation. Even Caleb noticed that Ryan Collins no longer projected the same unwavering confidence he had displayed earlier. Ava quietly tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, "are they finally listening?" Angela gently squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "I hope so." The minutes seemed unusually long as every passing second stretched the silence even further. Then, from somewhere beyond the neighborhood, the distant sound of another engine echoed through the morning air. Unlike the earlier patrol vehicles, this one moved with unmistakable purpose. Noah looked toward the entrance of Maple Ridge Lane, then glanced back at Ryan with a serious expression. "He is coming," he said quietly. Ryan instinctively followed Noah's gaze. None of them knew exactly what would happen next, but for the first time that morning, it was no longer Marcus Bennett who appeared to be carrying the greatest weight of uncertainty. The approaching vehicle was not marked with flashing lights or unnecessary urgency, yet every officer on the street recognized it immediately. A dark department sport utility vehicle turned slowly onto Maple Ridge Lane, moving with deliberate purpose before stopping several yards behind the patrol cars. The engine fell silent. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Even the whispers among the neighbors disappeared as every pair of eyes shifted toward the driver's door. Officer Noah Carter quietly straightened his posture. Ryan Collins and Jacob Mercer instinctively exchanged uncertain glances before looking back toward the vehicle. The door opened, and Chief Daniel Harper stepped onto the pavement. His uniform was immaculate, his expression composed, and his pace steady as he walked toward the gathering crowd. At first, he appeared focused only on understanding the situation. Then his eyes landed on Marcus Bennett. Everything changed. His confident stride slowed almost instantly. The color seemed to drain from his face as he noticed the restraints around Marcus's wrists. He stopped walking for a fraction of a second, staring in complete disbelief before continuing forward with renewed urgency. Every officer present noticed the reaction. Ryan had expected the chief to take command of the investigation immediately. Instead, Daniel Harper looked as though he had arrived moments too late to prevent something he had feared for years. He approached Marcus first, ignoring every report waiting to be delivered. "Marcus," the chief said quietly, his voice carrying genuine concern. "Are you all right?" Marcus smiled with the same calm dignity he had shown since the beginning of the morning. "I am fine, Chief. Everyone has remained professional. There appears to be some confusion that I believe can be resolved." Daniel closed his eyes for the briefest moment before opening them again. The response somehow made the situation even more painful. Marcus was reassuring him. The chief slowly turned toward Ryan Collins and Jacob Mercer. His expression remained controlled, but the disappointment behind his eyes was impossible to miss. "Who authorized this?" he asked evenly. Ryan stepped forward. "Chief, we received a report identifying Mr. Bennett as a possible suspect connected to an active investigation. We followed department procedure while awaiting confirmation." Daniel listened without interrupting. "Did either of you verify the source before placing him in restraints?" Ryan hesitated. Dispatch advised that additional verification was still pending. The silence that followed seemed heavier than any raised voice could have been. Daniel looked from Ryan to Jacob, then briefly toward Noah, who lowered his eyes with quiet respect. Finally, the chief looked back at Marcus. The neighbors watched every movement without fully understanding why the highest-ranking officer in the department appeared so deeply unsettled. Angela noticed something she had never expected to see. Daniel Harper was not looking at Marcus as a suspect. He was looking at him as someone whose respect mattered deeply. Caleb noticed it too. The authority in the neighborhood had quietly shifted, though no one had yet explained why. Daniel took a slow breath before speaking again. Ryan, Jacob, there is something both of you should have known before this morning began. Neither officer responded. Their earlier certainty had completely disappeared. The chief glanced around at the gathered residents, many of whom were still recording from their driveways. Then he looked directly at Marcus once more, almost as if asking silent permission to continue. Marcus gave a slight nod. Daniel faced his officers again. Marcus Bennett has spent years helping this department become better than it was yesterday. Some of the policies you follow today exist because he helped build them. The words settled over the neighborhood like a sudden change in the air. Ryan slowly turned toward Marcus, seeing him for the first time not as the subject of an investigation, but as a man whose influence had quietly shaped the very badge he proudly wore. Ryan Collins felt every eye on the street settle on him. Yet none carried more weight than the quiet gaze of Marcus Bennett. Only minutes earlier, he had believed he understood exactly what kind of situation he had been responding to. Now that certainty had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable realization that facts gathered too quickly can sometimes hide the truth in plain sight. Jacob Mercer stood beside him without speaking, replaying every decision they had made since arriving on Maple Ridge Lane. Chief Daniel Harper stepped closer, his voice remaining calm, but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone determined to teach rather than simply criticize. Marcus Bennett has never asked this department for special treatment, he said. In fact, he has spent years reminding every officer that accountability begins with ourselves. Ryan swallowed quietly. Chief, we acted on the information we received. Daniel nodded once. I know you believed you were following procedure. But procedure is only the beginning. Judgment is what separates a good officer from a great one. The words settled over the gathered crowd with remarkable clarity. Marcus remained silent, allowing the conversation to unfold without interruption. His composure only deepened the lesson that was taking shape before everyone watching. Daniel continued. Do either of you remember the ethics seminar every new patrol officer attends during advanced field training? Jacob answered first. Yes, Chief. Do you remember the guest instructor who spent an entire afternoon discussing community trust, respectful communication, and a responsibility to verify before making assumptions? Jacob's eyes slowly widened. Fragments of memory returned with surprising force. A conference room filled with young officers. A speaker whose calm voice never needed to rise. Stories about families, neighborhoods, and the lasting impact of every decision made while wearing a badge. Ryan's expression changed as the same memory surfaced. That was... He stopped before finishing the sentence. Daniel completed it for him. Marcus Bennett. Silence spread once again across the neighborhood. Several officers lowered their heads as recognition replaced confusion. Noah Carter simply nodded, knowing they had finally connected the pieces for themselves. Daniel looked toward the residents gathered along the sidewalks. Many of you know Marcus as your neighbor, he said. Inside this department, many officers know him as the man whose instruction helped shape how we serve this city. Angela noticed tears forming in Ava's eyes, though this time they came from relief rather than fear. Caleb stood a little taller, watching his father remain humble despite every opportunity to remind others of his accomplishments. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady and gentle. Chief, I appreciate your words, but this is not about who I am. It is about making sure every person receives the same patience before conclusions are reached. Daniel looked at him with unmistakable respect. That is exactly why your work has mattered for so many years. Ryan slowly turned toward Marcus. Sir, he said sincerely, I did not recognize you, and I should have asked more questions before making decisions. Marcus met his eyes without resentment. Recognition should never determine how someone is treated, Officer Collins. The stranger you have never met deserves the same dignity as the person you know well. Those simple words struck everyone present more deeply than any formal lecture ever could. The morning had quietly transformed from an investigation into something far more significant. It had become a living reminder that character reveals itself not during moments of comfort, but during moments when assumptions are challenged by the truth. And as Chief Daniel Harper looked across the silent neighborhood, he understood that the next decision would determine not only the future of two officers, but the trust of an entire community. Chief Daniel Harper allowed the silence to settle before taking another step toward Marcus Bennett. Without saying a word, he reached into his pocket, produced a small key, and carefully removed the temporary restraints from Marcus's wrists. The quiet metallic sound seemed to echo far beyond the front yard. It marked the moment when uncertainty gave way to truth. Marcus gently rubbed his wrists for only a second before lowering his hands to his sides. There was no anger in his expression, no desire to embarrass anyone standing before him. Instead, he looked first at his family, smiling reassuringly at Angela, Caleb, and Ava, silently telling them that the hardest part of the morning was finally over. The neighbors watched with growing disbelief. Just minutes earlier, they had witnessed a respected member of their community being treated with suspicion. Now, they were watching the chief of police personally restore his dignity in front of everyone. Daniel turned toward the gathered residents. "Everyone here deserves an explanation," he said. This morning began with information that appeared credible but had not been fully verified. That responsibility belongs to this department, and ultimately it belongs to me. His willingness to accept responsibility surprised many people. Public apologies from leaders were rare, but Daniel understood that rebuilding trust always began with honesty. He then faced Ryan Collins and Jacob Mercer once again. "There is something else you need to know," he said. "Marcus Bennett is not only one of the architects of our Community Trust Initiative. 3 months ago, the City Council appointed him to chair the Independent Public Accountability Advisory Board." Ryan looked confused for a brief moment before the significance of those words became clear. That board operated separately from the police department. Its responsibility was to review officer conduct, recommend policy improvements, and evaluate how departments earn public confidence. Jacob slowly exhaled, realizing that Marcus had never needed authority printed on a badge. His influence came from the respect he had earned over decades of service. Daniel continued. "Marcus never requested this position. Community organizations, neighborhood leaders, judges, educators, and law enforcement professionals recommended him because they believed he represented fairness." Marcus lowered his eyes modestly, as though uncomfortable hearing his accomplishments listed aloud. "Titles are temporary," he said quietly. "Character is what remains after people stop introducing you." Those words lingered in the still morning air. Several neighbors nodded without realizing they were doing so. Noah Carter smiled faintly, remembering nearly the exact same sentence from the leadership seminar months earlier. It had stayed with him ever since. Ryan took one slow step toward Marcus. "Sir, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an honest promise that I will learn from today." Marcus met his eyes with quiet kindness. "Learning is the only reason mistakes have value." Jacob spoke next. "I looked at your photographs, your certificates, and the people standing beside you, but I dismissed them because I believed I already understood the situation." Marcus answered gently. "Sometimes the most important evidence is the willingness to ask one more question." Angela finally walked across the lawn and stood beside her husband. Caleb and Ava followed close behind. Seeing them reunited brought visible relief to many neighbors who had remained outside throughout the entire morning. The tension that had gripped Maple Ridge Lane slowly gave way to something unexpected. It was not celebration. It was reflection. Everyone present understood they had witnessed far more than a misunderstanding. They had witnessed the fragile distance between assumption and truth, and how quickly that distance can change lives. As Chief Daniel Harper looked across the quiet street filled with watching families, he knew the events of that morning would soon extend far beyond one neighborhood, because lessons learned in public have a way of reaching people who were never there to see them. By early afternoon, the quiet events on Maple Ridge Lane had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Several residents who had recorded portions of the encounter shared the videos with local community groups, not to create outrage, but to show how quickly an ordinary misunderstanding could become a powerful lesson about responsibility. Within hours, city officials, civic leaders, and members of the police department had already begun reviewing the incident in detail. Chief Daniel Harper understood that restoring confidence required more than words spoken in a front yard. It required visible action. That same afternoon, he called an administrative meeting with command staff, training supervisors, and legal advisors. Ryan Collins and Jacob Mercer attended as well, still processing everything they had learned. The meeting was not driven by blame. It was driven by accountability. Daniel addressed the room with unusual honesty. If this can happen to someone who has spent years helping us improve public trust, he began, then we have to ask ourselves how often we may overlook the humanity of people we have never met. No one disagreed. The discussion lasted for hours. Procedures for verifying anonymous reports were examined. Communication protocols were reviewed. Supervisors proposed additional safeguards before temporary restraints could be used during situations where immediate danger had not been established. Every recommendation carried the same goal: slow down, verify, respect. Meanwhile, Marcus returned home with his family. The neighborhood slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm, but people continued stopping by throughout the afternoon. Some brought flowers. Others simply wanted to shake his hand. Mr. Franklin arrived, carrying a homemade peach pie prepared by his wife. "It is not much," he said with a warm smile, "but neighbors take care of neighbors." Marcus thanked him sincerely before placing the pie on the kitchen counter beside several handwritten notes that had already been delivered throughout the day. Angela quietly read one of them. It came from a young family across the street. They thanked Marcus for remaining calm when others might have responded with anger. They wrote that their children had witnessed not only a difficult situation, but also an unforgettable example of dignity under pressure. Caleb sat at the dining room table reading messages that continued arriving through social media. Friend from school expressed support. Teachers shared encouraging words. Ava carefully drew a picture showing the family standing together beneath a bright blue sky. At the top, she wrote in careful handwriting, "Kindness is stronger than fear." Marcus smiled when he saw it. Later that evening, Chief Daniel Harper knocked on the Bennett family's front door without cameras, reporters, or department staff. Marcus welcomed him inside. The two men sat together over coffee while Angela prepared fresh sweet tea. Their conversation was quiet and thoughtful. Daniel apologized once more, this time not as chief of police, but simply as a friend who believed the department could do better. Marcus listened patiently before answering. Trust is not built because mistakes never happen. Trust grows when people choose integrity after mistakes happen. Daniel nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom behind those words. Before leaving, he made one request. "Would you consider helping us redesign our next leadership program?" Marcus smiled gently. "Only if every officer in a room is willing to ask difficult questions about themselves before asking them about anyone else." Daniel extended his hand. "That is exactly the lesson we need." As the evening sun settled behind the trees lining Maple Ridge Lane, the neighborhood looked almost identical to the way it had that morning. Children played outside again. Neighbors talked across driveways. Porch lights slowly flickered on. Yet everyone who had witnessed the events of that day understood something had quietly changed. Not because one man had revealed an important title, but because humility, accountability, and compassion had proven stronger than assumption several weeks later. The story that began on a quiet residential street had become something far greater than a single morning of misunderstanding. Across Greenville, conversations about respect, fairness, and responsibility were taking place in classrooms, community centers, churches, and police briefing rooms. The incident was no longer remembered because of the mistake that had occurred. It was remembered because of the way people chose to respond afterward. The police department officially introduced updated verification procedures and expanded its leadership curriculum to include additional community engagement training. Every new officer entering the department would now participate in discussions built around real situations that demonstrated how quickly assumptions could shape decisions. At the center of those lessons was not embarrassment or blame, but the belief that every encounter carried an opportunity to strengthen public trust. Marcus Bennett accepted Daniel Harper's invitation to help lead the first session. As officers filled the training room, many expected a lecture about policies and procedures. Instead, Marcus walked to the front of the room, carrying nothing more than a notebook. He looked around the room, recognizing both familiar faces and officers he had never met before. Ryan Collins and Jacob Mercer sat in the front row by choice. They listened carefully as Marcus began with a simple question. How many people have you met today without knowing anything about their lives before they spoke their first word? The room remained silent. Marcus smiled gently. That number is probably higher than you think. He spent the next hour sharing stories about trust, listening, and the quiet responsibility carried by every public servant. He never mentioned his own experience on Maple Ridge Lane. He did not have to. Everyone in the room already understood why his words mattered. When the session ended, Ryan approached Marcus once more. I have thought about that morning every day, he admitted. It changed the way I introduce myself before asking questions. Marcus nodded with quiet approval. Then something good came from it. Jacob stepped forward as well. I have started reminding younger officers that confidence should never replace curiosity. Marcus smiled. That lesson will serve them for the rest of their careers. Outside the training center, Daniel Harper watched the three men talking together. Weeks earlier, they had stood on opposite sides of a misunderstanding. Now, they stood together with a shared purpose. The transformation did not erase the past, but it gave the future a stronger foundation. Back on Maple Ridge Lane, life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Children rode bicycles beneath the same maple trees. Neighbors gathered for weekend cookouts. Mr. Franklin still waved from his front porch every morning, and Angela's flower beds bloomed brighter than ever beneath the warm Carolina sun. One evening, as Marcus and Caleb watched the sunset from the porch, Caleb quietly asked, "Dad, were you ever angry?" Marcus thought for a long moment before answering. Of course I was disappointed, but anger alone cannot build the kind of future I want you to inherit. Caleb nodded thoughtfully. Then what can? Marcus looked down the peaceful street where neighbors greeted one another without hesitation. Courage to tell the truth, wisdom to listen, and the willingness to see a person before seeing anything else. The evening breeze gently lifted the American flag beside the porch as the last rays of sunlight settled across the neighborhood. It was a simple moment, almost ordinary again, yet everyone who had lived through that unforgettable morning understood one lasting truth. A badge can represent authority, but only character earns trust. And when dignity is met with humility, justice does not simply correct a mistake. It leaves behind a better path for everyone who follows. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.